In today's episode, we're focusing on one of the most dynamic parts of the Canadian economy, Indigenous business. My guest is Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. She's an engineer by training and a tireless advocate for Indigenous economic prosperity. We talk about the exponential growth of Indigenous entrepreneurship and the unique strengths these businesses bring to the economy. She also takes me through the structural barriers Indigenous business people continue to face, from outdated policies to new tariffs. Tabitha also shares her insights as a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-US Relations. Here's our conversation. Tabitha, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start just on a personal note. So you're from Nipissing First Nation, and I am like an honorary citizen of North Bay through marriage. But I think with people figuring out their summer plans and so on, we have to say this is like an incredible part of the world, right?
Yes.
An incredible part of Ontario to visit.
Definitely. It's gorgeous. My dad actually grew up at Serpent River First Nation, which is quite a bit further north, about 6 hours north of Toronto. But we are all members of Nipissing. So my parents live there now, and it's just a beautiful place, beautiful lake to be on and spend time and just reset for sure.
Yes, there's part of me that kind of wants to keep Lake Nipissing a secret. But then,
Yeah.
if there's enough to go around. There's enough a beautiful beachy shoreline to go around.
Yeah,
Um,
there are days I can, my parents have a home on the lake in our community, and there are days where you don't see another boat at all, which is lovely.
yes. Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
So tell me about the road that took you from an engineering degree at Waterloo to the CEO chair at the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business.
Yeah, so I went into engineering with the purpose to work to support Indigenous communities, my own community, in energy projects and energy field. I did engineering, true engineering, for a number of years, and then through the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario, had the opportunity to work with communities on energy projects and energy planning across the province for 5 years. And through that time, I became involved with, we were called Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business at the time, attending their events, and just always felt very inspired by the work that they did. And I kind of got to a point in my career in energy where I wanted to do something different and more on a national scale, and keep working with communities. And I didn't feel like I could stay in the energy sector and move up in my career and still do that at the same level. So made the move to CCAB actually as their chief operating officer, and then I became the CEO March of 2020. So the actual day that we all moved to work from home.
Right. Interesting times to be a leader of an organization, right?
Definitely. That 30, 60, 90-day plan that you do in your interview quickly was regrouping on what my thoughts were about what we were going to do. But it definitely demonstrated how important organizations that support business are during that period of time, and the resiliency that we saw in businesses across Canada as well, but the support that they needed to manage through the difficult time and ensure that supports that were developed really met the needs of Indigenous businesses in particular.
So, what should we know about the state of Indigenous business right now in Canada?
So, it's the growth in Indigenous business, the Indigenous economy is exponential. We're seeing businesses being created, 5 to 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous business across every sector and size. We see, businesses who are really at the leading edge of some innovation and technology. And then from a community perspective, community-owned businesses, large-scale businesses that are partnered with corporations across Canada, but with the intention that they will lead those businesses themselves. Um, there are still a lot of hurdles and barriers for Indigenous business. There is still a lot of bias that exists, but we're starting to see that generational wealth start to be recreated. Second-generation businesses in the Indigenous community, and that's really where our work is going to be so important.
What is it about the nature of Indigenous business that's making it so fired up right now?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, I think first, Indigenous people are very resilient. We've been through significant barriers and have been intentionally excluded from the economy for many, many years. And so I think there is this determination and resilience to be able to face the barriers and hurdles and unexpected pandemics and tariffs, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, and to continue to push. I think that the other is, Jen Harper from Cheekbone Beauty, who's an Indigenous cosmetics company, has been quoted as saying that we were the OGs of ESG. And I think that, now that the world is really focusing on our environment and sustainability, those are things that are at the core value of Indigenous people. And in Indigenous business, we see Indigenous businesses for so long have been created really thinking about the environment, thinking about 7 generations ahead, and also about giving back to their community. And those, I think, are things that consumers and investors are really valuing now. And, you know, um, it's table stakes now. People understand, in Canada anyway, that without working with Indigenous communities and businesses on major projects, we won't progress. Um, and that's helped for sure to grow the economy. We've seen corporations set targets and do work to work better with Indigenous communities and businesses, to set targets around Indigenous procurement, Indigenous employees, and that is definitely spurring growth and capacity building as well.
So on the tariff question, we've done work at the Institute to try to identify the communities in Canada that are most exposed to the tariffs in Canada. And often it's communities that are rural, that are remote, not very economically diverse. Are you seeing that same, I guess, phenomenon with Indigenous businesses in terms of how exposed they are to the tariffs?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because with so much uncertainty, I think it's difficult for us to really understand the impact or what the impact might be. But definitely, there are very high concentrations of Indigenous business in sectors that are high export sectors to the US. So, oil and gas for sure. There's a very high percentage of Indigenous businesses involved in that space from a procurement perspective, ownership perspective, or impact benefit resource revenue sharing agreements that communities have with respect to resources, and also Indigenous people working in those sectors. And that is the same for forestry and mining. Those were all sectors that were early movers in doing better with Indigenous business and communities. And we know, particularly if we look at forestry, the number of Indigenous businesses and that are procuring or supplying to those industries, but also the number of businesses in forestry that are owned by Indigenous communities. And with the existing softwood lumber tariffs, additional tariffs on top of that, that's definitely an area of concern. And seafood also, with the tariffs that China has put on seafood, um, the additional tariffs, if applicable from the U.S., depending on CUSMA compliance, um, will have a big hit on that sector. And there are a number of seafood operations owned by Indigenous businesses and communities. So that's an area that we're really watching as well. And then, as you said, any time that there is a social economic disadvantage to any group, any economic downturn does hurt those people and impact those people more so. So, just in general, from a perspective of where we know Indigenous people are in this country and the economic gaps that exist, it is something that we'll be really watching to ensure there are supports there.
So that leads to my next question, which is if there was a response from federal, provincial, territorial governments to to this tariff situation specifically for Indigenous business and people living in Indigenous communities, is there a particular policy response that you would see in this
I think,
particular moment?
yeah, during COVID, we saw the number of supports that came out for businesses, and initially, when they were rolled out, a number of them First Nation, Métis, and Inuit businesses couldn't apply to for different reasons. So I think the most I would say is that ensuring that considerations around the Indian Act, for example, around Indigenous business and where they bank. So, at that time, only about a third of Indigenous businesses had a relationship with one of the major banks. And when the emergency business program was first put out, you had to have a relationship with one of those major banks. So immediately we had 2/3 of Indigenous businesses who couldn't access the CEBA loans. And that was changed eventually. But it meant that there was a delay in those businesses accessing support. And the same thing with the wage subsidy. Um, any business that was owned by a community, which we have a number of economic development corporations set up in this country, where the corporation is owned in part, or shareholder of that corporation is the First Nation community. And that's structured specifically because the Indian Act has barriers for us to be able to access capital. But the wage subsidy originally said that if you had a government as a partner shareholder, you were not eligible for the wage subsidy. So that again was us, advocating at federal government to have that changed, and we were successful. But it was about a month delay in economic development corporations being able to access the wage subsidy. So definitely, we need to be in discussions about what sectors are going to be hardest hit and how are we ensuring that there are support programs for those sectors, um, and that ensuring also that any and all of those issues were unintentional, but ensuring that we don't have those, that we're considering when programs are being developed exactly to ensure that they meet the needs of all businesses.
It sounds to me like there wasn't there weren't Indigenous people at the table when those policies were devised, or there wasn't perhaps the kind of advanced consultation that could have avoided those
Yeah.
problems.
Everything was moving so fast during the pandemic, for sure. The response of the government had to be very quick. Um, but interesting that some of the barriers, under the Indian Act specifically, are Government of Canada acts, um, and that those weren't considered in developing the programs. And I'll say, it was when we identified those issues, things did move very quickly. So we're really thankful for that. But yeah, definitely, those things weren't being considered and there wasn't engagement or conversation around how best to develop those programs. And so whatever, programs are coming out specifically as we continue to see discussion about that, we would want to be sure that we're at the table to ensure that they meet all the needs.
So you are at a big table right now, which is the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations. How do you feel about how Indigenous interests are being represented in a kind of pan-Canadian approach to dealing with what the U.S. is doing?
Yeah, it's really an honor to be able to be on the council, to have an Indigenous business voice there, to be talking about just what we're talking about now, what sectors really need to be considered. Um, and also to be on the table with other business leaders from across the country, because one of the benefits of me being there is getting this type of language and thought process into everybody else that's around the table, not just the Prime Minister and his team, but other business leaders. And that's been a big benefit because some of those leaders have really large following. They're very well respected. So if they start talking about Indigenous business and those perspectives, that just moves our discussion even further. The one thing I think that's missing is conversations from rights leaders. I'm a business representative of my members, and I do work for all Indigenous businesses in the economy in Canada. But I'm not there as a rights elected leader, and those conversations need to be happening. So when we talk about interprovincial trade barriers and those tables where those conversations are being had, what's missing there in my perspective is Indigenous rights elected leaders.
I think that that leads into another area that I wanted to talk to you about, which is around this the sudden excitement around energy
Mhm.
projects it's not sudden. I mean, we've been talking about energy
Yeah.
projects for a long time, but a kind of renewed excitement around what could happen because of the pressures that Canada's under, that it could actually, unlock new opportunities. Maybe there's more of a political consensus across Canada for some of the projects that have been discussed for years. But I wanted to quote from John Desjardins of the Indigenous Resource Network, who I'm sure you saw his piece in the Globe recently, where he says, unfortunately, Indigenous communities and groups are not central to this conversation that needs to change if you want Canadian energy moving again. So to your point about rights leaders and rights holders being at the table, what would you say about the tenor of the conversation that's happening around some of these major projects?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely missing to say, it's for sure moving faster through regulatory processes, looking for a one assessment window so that if you have a linear project, you don't have various different regulatory process to go through, are all very important. And, I think that will help grow the economy in Canada and are needed. But um, the process in working with communities and getting community approval and ultimately community equity participation in those projects is going to be a requirement, and those conversations should be happening now. And I agree with John, we don't see that happening, those conversations. And if we're going to move faster, there is a real opportunity for Indigenous communities to start to be in that conversation at the very beginning. And we've seen in the past that that's when projects actually move faster. When the Indigenous community is actually a partner in the project, they've already had, an opportunity to participate in what will the impact of this project be. If you look at an example of a transmission line, and we see now in Ontario projects where the transmitter and the communities in the area are actually have formed a partnership before the transmission line is even being started to be built and planned. That's the opportunity for those communities to be able to assess where the line should go to avoid impact on their traditional lands and medicines. And that's, de-risks a project significantly, helps to support the project getting through the impact assessment agreement much faster, or the process much faster. So those conversations should be happening now. I mean, of course, as we talk often about energy and pipelines, I mean, there needs to be a proponent and a business plan as well. But I think what would really move things faster if there was support for communities along any type of area where infrastructure is going to be built to start to build that capacity themselves. Who do they want to partner with? Do they, support that type of technology or infrastructure? So we need to get that information into communities' hands about where these, in thinking about the different campaigns that people are talking about, where are these potential projects that might be fast tracked? How are the communities already thinking about that? Who do they want their potential partners to be? If we think about Cedar LNG project as an example, it was the community of Haisla and the board made of Haisla members who decided how they wanted that project to be built. And then they evaluated who the partners would be. And they needed those partners to understand their values around sustainability and using the least amount of carbon to process the gas. And Chief Crystal Smith speaks about how much better that project was able to go because the community was leading it. So if we really want to move projects faster, we need to build that capacity and support communities in those areas to start building how they want to see a project be built, and then find the partners that they want to work with.
Do you feel in some ways that private sector understands this a little bit more than government does?
I think we see private sector doing, a really good job in a lot of areas in working with communities. I think in my experience, more in the energy sector as well, the time at which the policy is developed doesn't really allow for those projects, for those partnerships to be built in the trusted way that they need to be. So it is difficult, sometimes let's say an infrastructure announcement or a need for infrastructure is announced, private sector is trying to move at the speed of which government has announced that the time in which you can respond to an RFP or an RFI. And if that relationship hasn't been built with the community, it's very difficult to meet within those timelines. And that's why we need to be, ensuring that communities have the opportunity to be participants in long before the private sector comes. So I think in a lot of cases, we do see that private sector understands that, but yeah, government isn't giving them enough time or a roadmap to start to build those relationships. Though we definitely do see within our membership, at CCIB, our membership is both Indigenous businesses and non-Indigenous businesses. And we see a lot of really strong partnerships being built between community and community businesses and corporations. And hopefully those partnerships will be able to take advantage of some of the investment in infrastructure that we expect to see.
It seems to me that if we're, having bold conversations about Canada's future and, stepping up and seizing opportunities, and there's all kinds of conversations about different projects that could be unleashed, that having everybody part of that vision would push us or accelerate our move forward, rather than just having certain players at the table.
Yeah, as I was just in London at a Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit, and it's more important. It's now more than ever important for us to strengthen those relationships. And there was a group of Indigenous leaders, chiefs, business leaders, talking to UK investors about just that, about investment in Canada and investing in projects where Indigenous communities are equity partners is a safer investment, does allow for things to move faster. And the rise of Indigenous ownership in infrastructure and energy and natural resource projects is a game changer for this country. And, where some people may think of it as a barrier, I think the acceptance of that need, the number of Supreme Court cases that have solidified and really started to provide some type of clarity for private sector as well. And just that, people are really understanding what free, prior, informed consent means. They understand that that's table stakes. And that's actually a big advantage for us as Canada to move forward, that we're beyond that question of whether it's important, and people have accepted it. But completely to your point, we need everyone on the table to be understanding that for us to really move forward. What, again, when we think about energy in Ontario, initially when there was procurement for renewable energy in Ontario, there were incentives for Indigenous communities to be partners on those projects, but there wasn't any capacity building happening in the communities. So if you think about some communities who, they're buried in duty to consult requests and conversations.
Right.
And
Binders and binders arriving
yeah,
at their door. Yeah.
exactly. And that might be the same person who's also your lands manager or your housing manager or social services. So one thing that Ontario did that was really incredible and that still exists is support a resource in the community to be focused on energy, to be an energy champion, they were called, and also support the community to build a community energy plan. So to do that early engagement about what type of technologies do we support as a community, and in some, it was very clear that they didn't want any hydroelectric, nothing in their water. So we've already, done the work so that if a proponent comes and proposes a hydroelectric project, the community knows the answer. And that work was happening, in advance of the next rounds. And because of that capacity building that was happening and the ability for communities to be more prepared for when a proponent comes to their door, as we saw more generations of renewable project RFPs come out, we saw more and more communities partnering. And at the very end of my time there was a large procurement for larger projects, and 13 of the 16 had Indigenous equity in their project. And I think there's lots that we can learn from that now, if we can be doing the same type of support for planning for communities and that other earlier engagement.
what just to wrap up, are there some specific policy recommendations that you have at the council that would really supercharge the advancement of Indigenous business, especially right now in this bizarre moment that we find ourselves in, where
Yeah.
we're looking for new markets and considering a world where the United States isn't as big perhaps a trading partner going forward in the future? There's some things that we should be doing.
Yeah. So definitely there is still a capacity issue from access to capital for Indigenous businesses and for communities and infrastructure as well. So, when we look at larger infrastructure projects, the loan guarantee program, the national loan guarantee program, it's really great to see that it's been proposed that grow to 10 billion. Those type of new opportunities for capital access are so important, and a varied offering is important too. Infrastructure Bank has been doing some incredible deals and supporting communities in being part of building revenue generating projects and being part of them. And for entrepreneurs also, we need to continue to look at access to capital. As we think about trade, so we've just completed 2 large research projects on Indigenous businesses exporting. And there's a huge interest. We already, there is a large percentage that are exporting, but interest to those markets is it's very high. And when we're talking, so, as I said, in the UK, we've had conversations with France, with Chile, with Germany on interest to have more Indigenous businesses importing into those countries. So, the establishment of supports for Indigenous businesses to be trade ready. There are some programming. We've done pilots with some of the program that exists to look specifically at how we can put an Indigenous lens on some of that, like the Trade Accelerator program as an example, to bring in, what is the perspective of the Indian Act? What are the taxation differences if you're on a in your business operates on a First Nation? So really looking at how we can tweak some of the already program that's there, but specific for Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then, definitely in infrastructure, both, as I've said, like capacity building for communities to be equity partners, but also incentivization of corporations to bring on equity partnerships and procurement in all infrastructure projects that are happening. So we've seen a lot of movement on the 5% target from federal government on procurement, not without its hiccups for sure.
Right.
But you talk to Indigenous businesses and they will say that they have seen a difference in clear, definitive impact of that 5% target on corporations looking to work with them and doing the work to really search them out. So we have to ensure that that policy stays in the federal government and that we incentivize with the infrastructure spending that's coming, that any proponent includes that they're looking to purchase from Indigenous business.
Could you just say a little bit more about the Indian Act and what barriers there are embedded in it to exporting or exporters, Indigenous exporters?
So not so much barriers to export, but there are specific. If you're on a First Nation, there are specific differences in the taxation. There are definitely differences in your access to capital because a business doesn't own the land. So to have the collateral to be able to grow their business or to access equity is definitely different as well. As we look further, and I'm not naive to think that we'd be able to get this moving with the current administration in the South, but there is a lot of conversation around trade zones between Indigenous communities and nations within Canada, but also within Canada and our neighbors to the south. And that is a conversation that we're having a lot of discussion about with our friends in the US and New Zealand and Australia about the ability for nations to trade like we used to without taxation.
Is the J Treaty that we have with the U.S., is that what's applicable there?
So the J Treaty currently to date has been more put in place by the US actually than Canada. And the treatment has been to date more around people traveling across the border than goods. I think we will need to have a few Supreme Court cases for us to really see the Jay Treaty be in use like it should be. I mean, as written, the Jay Treaty does say that Indigenous people should be able to cross the border for travel, but also for the sale of goods. But I don't think we have enough court cases to date to really be able to see that put into action. But it would be the same concept that, as Indigenous nations of the globe, we traded between one another long before colonization and settlers arrived, definitely here on Turtle Island. And the ability for us to be able to bring back those trade zones is something that many Indigenous scholars and people around the globe really are looking at how we can continue to do that. In CUSMA, we did push for a specific chapter on Indigenous business and Indigenous trade. We weren't successful, but there are specific clauses that recognize, definitely with respect to artisans and Indigenous artisans, that they should be exempt from taxation within the CUSMA. But there's other articles that had promise but haven't really been developed fully. We would like to see that move forward. The UK and New Zealand has a specific chapter with respect to Indigenous people and importers. So we are seeing that move around the world, and we're continuing to look at new trade agreements as they come up for renewal and push for some of that recognition.
Tabitha, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. You've left us with a lot to think about, and best of luck on the Prime Minister's Council, which I'm sure will be meeting for some time.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to Futureproofing Canada. Our executive producer is Cléa Desjardins. Our producer is Ricardo Montrose, and our production assistants are Elissa Coury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and engineered by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you like what you heard and you'd like to find out more about our work at the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org. You can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Futureproofing Canada.